everyone. Next up, we have Miss Ikroop Kullar. Miss Ikroop is a counseling psychologist based in New Delhi. Her fields of interest include psychoanalysis, narrative inquiry, and exploring maternal subjectivity. She presently supports young adults and teens, offering counseling sessions online. And today, she would be focusing on a very important aspect related to every child's mental health. That is, how can parents understand and support mental health issues? So before we start, I would like to say that the last 10 minutes are a short Q&A session. So do jot down your questions in the chat box below for Ms. Ikroop to answer. Ms. Ikroop, you could take it forward.
Hi, thanks Adya for the introduction, and thanks Collegey for having me on this panel. I'll keep the thanks very brief because I'm quite nervous about finishing all this within 20 minutes. So you'll have to bear with me if I get a bit breathless through it. Let me just share my screen real quick with you. Okay, I hope my screen is visible to everyone. You can just send a thumbs up or something, Adya, if you can see my screen.
And yes, it's visible.
Okay, great. And thanks for everyone who's tuned in. I know it's the weekend for us, and thanks for taking the time out to listen, especially because listening is something I'm going to be talking about a lot today. So I really appreciate it. The topic I have is mindfulness and mental health fitness, and how parents specifically can better understand and respond to mental health issues. The approach I am taking to this is more on the lines of how we can initiate and sustain conversation around mental health and emotional life in general, which even under normal circumstances is essential, but especially now when children have to do a lot of figuring out of growing up, which was previously done in spaces like the school or university, and public space in general in a community sense. Well, there are online communities which are doing great work, but there is a very serious shift of how these things are navigated. So questions about our intimate identity, curiosities about gender, sexuality, changing feelings, our friendships, our relationships with people, with family, with food, with our bodies. All of these are confronted within a family unit, and that comes with its own unique set of challenges and potentials depending on what your family situation looks like, how much openness and dialogue exists to talk about confusing feelings. So this discussion is more relevant than ever now, I think. And it becomes more important to have an ongoing dialogue around our emotional experience. Okay. I'm just having a bit of technical issues, but yeah, we have this. So the first requirement for having a dialogue is to have access to a language to communicate these feelings. So in the case of a parent-child relationship, a lot of communication is often restricted to advice giving, or in the form of instructions and directions and expectations, which doesn't leave a lot of room to discuss feelings, and particularly feelings of distress and an inability to cope and not meet these expectations that are made of them. And as a result, most of the attempts made by a child to communicate these feelings is either suppressed and then pent up, or the communication gets completely distorted. Let's consider anger as an example of how a feeling might be miscommunicated. Anger is in and of itself a destructive emotion. One second, can someone, I think because I'm co-hosting, I'm struggling to switch to the next slide.
We don't have a copy of this one. Yeah, it's showing up now.
I'm sorry about that. But yeah, as I said, anger is in and of itself considered to be a destructive emotion. It is difficult to bear not only for someone receiving it, but also for the one enacting it. And the attempt of squashing this anger instantly on the part of the parent is natural and logical on the surface, at least. And it might be out of concern that you put a stop to it. But like any emotion, anger also exists in varying degrees of intensity, and thus needing a varied set of responses which is best suited to its intensity. But when we are too quick to remove any and all expressions of anger, we lose the possibility of listening to that which is being communicated through it, which in many cases is the child saying, I am not okay with how things are. I need something to change. So, anger here might be, in fact, a sign of assertiveness and the ability in the child to seek better circumstances. Also, it might be a sign that they are able to, the fact that they are able to express anger is indicative of a possibly healthy family environment, because the child feels a sense of safety and security in expressing an emotion like anger. They have a belief that the relationship between the parent and child will be able to withstand such a attack, so to speak. It is only when we're able to trust another person with our action can we deliver it, especially when it's within a hierarchy of parent being an authority figure and having thus more control and power in this relationship. Acts of anger can be extremely empowering to a certain degree. Anger in many cases is the most accessible emotion that a child anchors other more unbearable and complex feelings onto. So while it might be difficult for the child to openly admit feelings of intense fear and anxiety, helplessness, which commonly are seen as signs of weakness in our society, anger appears as an accessible option to disguise or chain these more complex, sensitive feelings behind. However, if the parent is focused on only fixing the issue of anger and removing it, they might lose the single thread that could lead them to getting a picture of what is hiding and being carried by the child underneath all this frustration. So let's move on to the question now of how to and how much to respond to an emotion. When we think of responding, we might be imagining a very active reaction and behavior. But a lot of response, first and foremost, just deals with listening and learning to listen in new ways, taking the stance of a curious, attentive listener and observer, being present to receive both direct what is directly said and indirectly expressed by the child. And one of the ways that we can think of this is through the idea of what is called the holding environment. The holding environment is a concept proposed by a British psychoanalyst and pediatrician called Donald Winnicott. And I'm going to build on this in more depth, but in relation to how we can use this as a concept of building a language that will affirm and contain feelings of the child, I think one of the pictures that we can compare it to is of a nest, and our attempt to take this posture, which is a mindful posture, and creating and cultivating an intentional space, just as a bird might twig by twig build a nest that can hold the eggs. So the holding environment is refers to the physical and emotional holding of a child's experiences without trying to fix or solve these difficulties. Holding the child's discomfort for long enough until they are ready to either regulate themselves or to seek the parents or an external help in regulating these difficult feelings. So I don't know if it's a good example, but it's kind of like taking the child's difficult feelings on rent from them, not changing them, not twisting them, but maybe digesting them, but most importantly, just holding them as they are until the child can take them back from you. So, if you were to think of a crisis situation, a common expression that we hear is don't just sit there, do something. But when we're trying to create and cultivate a holding environment, we have to do quite the opposite. So, it would be Don't just do something, sit there, hold what I am handing to you. And that's the essence of what validation looks like. You have to observe something before you can respond to it. You have to be attuned and attentive to what the person is asking for or trying to ask for. So there might be a great deal of expectation of patience from the parent in this situation, which might even require them to put their own immediate needs aside, or giving them to be held by someone else, whether that is your partner, extended support network, or relying on your community network, so that you can make more room for what your child is handing on to you. Um, you have to be, you cannot, you have to, this is, I'll get to this towards the end of my presentation, but I think this is a good moment to reiterate that self-regulation, which is self-care, is essential and a prerequisite for being able to be a reliable grown-up that that your child can depend on. So when the child has emotions leaking through them that they're not able to carry and they hand it to you, you don't have to shift or do anything. You just have to hold it and say, maybe you can even validate and say that, look what I am holding for you. This is a lot of anger that you have. I can see that you're scared. Um, when you want to talk about it, I am here. This is what affirming a feeling and giving validation sounds like. Another factor I think that needs addressing within the holding environment or just any conversation of a family that talks about feelings is developing the capacity to tolerate failure. And if you were to think about a situation where we have worked towards something, invested time and effort towards reaching a certain goal, the experience of watching it fall through and crumble apart can be extremely devastating. But not so much when we think of it in the context of play. So if you're able to visualize a little toddler playing with blocks, building a tower, putting one block over the other, you'll notice that the baby takes as much and maybe even more joy in watching the tower fall down. It's not such a permanent and scary feeling, and the baby is able to pick up the blocks and build the same tower again and again and again, and learn and grow through these repeated and playful attempts. But as we get older, creativity and play begin to be viewed mostly only through the lens of being the best at it, or competition and success. Any misstep or minor failure on track to that goal is considered very final and almost unacceptable, which makes taking even the initial few steps towards it much more daunting. You're more scared by the threat of encountering failures on the way that you are excited about. I'm sorry, you're much more um, you're much more scared at the threat of encountering failures on the way than you're able to be excited about possibly making it to the end. And I think this picture particularly is a great metaphor for how an environment can create more room for feeling as part of the process of learning and growing. Having expectations and holding fantasies of success for the child, believing that your child can make certain achievements possible, is essential and important for the child's self-esteem. Knowing that someone can see me achieving these things makes them realize that they have it in them to do it. But it should not have to be at the cost of losing value in their eyes or having the foundation of security and safety in the family. Even the most experienced climbers, as you can see in this picture, are able to make risky and thrilling maneuvers in climbing a boulder only when they know that the ones cheering them on are also carefully watching over them from a distance. Someone is spotting for her, and if she were to fall, she can make a safe landing and do it again. And the same goes for parents. Small failures are, as Sam said in his talk right now, small failures for both the child as well as for the parent are inevitable in growing. And not only inevitable, I would say essential in parenting as well. When a child knows that not every single need of theirs will be fulfilled instantly, they're able to bear ordinary amounts of frustration, which aids in their emotional and cognitive development. Finally, I want to talk about what I had addressed earlier, which is self regulation, which further paves the way for co regulation of the child's emotions. Self regulation essentially means taking care of yourself, taking care of your emotional needs as a parent, putting on your own seat belts, and whatever self care might look like for you, taking a day off from work, reaching out and relying more heavily on your partner, your extended support network, and perhaps even being open about these needs or breaks with your child, depending on their age and ability to make sense of that. Not underestimating their maturity, because children are very intelligent and observant and they can see what you're saying. And if it is dealt with denial, sometimes it can make the child feel betrayed and very confused. So, making age appropriate revelations to the child that, okay, I need to take a break right now, but this is temporary. I'm going to get back to it. And when you do that, the child is able to imitate that behavior. You're a mirror to the child, and maybe the child too will be able to see themselves asking for what they need more clearly. So the child might not feel the need to have to make up an excuse about a stomach ache why they don't want to go to school, and instead honestly say that I am very, very nervous about this test. So yeah, the parent has to take care of themselves so that they can be an available and continuous present in their child's life, and someone that the child can depend on. So I am going to stop right there. But before I close the discussion, there's this quote that I want to read from this book called Love and Rage by Nupur Dhingra Paiva. And a lot of what I've discussed today is actually structured based on her book. So I would recommend it to anyone interested in child psychology or just understanding the psyche of children in general. So this quote is by William Martin from his book, The Parent's Tao. Do not ask your children to strive for extraordinary lives. Such striving may seem admirable, but it is the way of foolishness. Help them instead to find the wonder and the marvel of an ordinary life. Show them the joy of tasting tomatoes, apples, and pears. Show them how to cry when pets and people die. Show them the infinite pleasure in the touch of a hand, and make the ordinary come alive for them. The extraordinary will take care of itself. Yeah, I think
First of
that.
all, I would like to thank you, Ms. Kullar, for such an informative session. And the quote you shared in the end had such a beautiful meaning to it. So, I'm sure you have made this session, this topic more interesting that we could have expected it to be. So, I think now we'll jump into the Q&A session. So, the first question that I have for you is that, there's usually a gap between the achievements of a child and the expectation of the parent. So, how would you like to address this gap?
Again, since this talk is essentially aimed at the parents, I would say that there's a difference between having expectations for the child and having expectations of the child for something you want. So having expectations for the child might be you visualizing um, better circumstances, achievement based on the child's potential, and keeping their pace in mind. But when we have expectations of the child, which are for ourselves in some way, that might have to do something with wanting to let the child have a life or have something that we were not able to get. And while that might be coming from a good place of giving the child what we were deprived of, it has to do with a need that is not fulfilled in the parent. And perhaps the parent needs to work through those feelings on their own, whether that means introspecting about it, being able to sort that out, or seeking professional help and dealing with their own needs as a child that their parents perhaps neglected or were not able to address. So I think that is where expectations and um, fantasies of having the child be something that you couldn't be would differ.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kullar, for answering that question. So the next question that I have is basically related to the Indian parenting system. That how the Indian parenting system is so traditional, where the children are on the back seat and the parents are the drivers. So according to you, as a psychologist, what changes would you like to bring to the system without disturbing its uniqueness?
That's a difficult question for me to answer because I'm also my mother's daughter, and
Okay.
it's hard to do that because that's a friction that all of us face when there's a generation gap. But um, while the changes, while we have moved on greatly in terms of what the relationship dynamic looks like, and children are more and more adept at dealing with things like, say, technology, we are far ahead of many parents in certain matters, and in some things we are far behind. So this kind of unsettles that hierarchy to a great extent. But I think what I have really emphasized across this presentation, which is things like listening and being a reliable, secure presence, is something that is so basic to any and all forms of strategies of parenting that you might apply, and across whatever the relationship dynamic might look like, feelings of need, wanting safety, wanting more distance or wanting more closeness, needing a hug. Um, they're all very universal needs. And when a parent is able to be attuned to that, no matter how much of love and attention is more common in a more collectivist society like ours, being able to then recognize, okay, maybe they need more space. So just listening to what your child is really trying to tell you, no matter where you are, is the answer to that, I think.
I couldn't agree to you more. So the next question we have is basically what most of the parents want to know. That as a parent, what could be the earliest sign of disruption of the mental health with the child?
Disruption of mental health. Um, I think children do give a lot of signs, and they even, I think this earliest sign, it really depends on the situation and the kind of issue that the child is having. And there's so many forms of mental health. There's issues related to mood, there's issues related to what we call conduct disorders, but they have a lot to do with what society considers that the child must admit. But I really think there's no go-to answer for this one. What, or at least I am not able to think of it off my head right off the bat right now. But the earliest sign is best understood when you actually just believe what the child says. So even though when I said that when a child is trying to communicate, say, anger, you have to have an openness to believe that something else is held behind this. You have to have an openness to understand that there's more behind this. But that doesn't mean that you need to do detective work. That, okay, she's angry at me. That's not what it is. Let me like figure out what this is and let her know. But that's not the stance that has to be there. It just has to be an openness to listening that there will be more. And at the same time, when children tell you something, you have to believe it. So while you have to have an openness to more possibilities, believing the child when they tell you something. So I think children, if you are open and available, you will know when the earliest sign comes because your child will tell you. Um, Unless, of course, there is other kinds of issues that are in the way, both developmental or even sources that threaten safety within the family environment, like if the child is experiencing a certain kind of trauma, they might not be able to talk about these feelings more openly. So like I said, just maintaining an open stance and you will know when the sign comes.
Thank you, Ms. Killer, for answering the question. So here's a question by Sahana in the chat box that parents often put their children on a pedestal. How do we deal with it? Pressure by the parents. How can we deal with that pressure?
How can we deal with that pressure? So, in an ideal situation, you should be able to have a space that you can communicate this to the parents and let yourself fail. But a lot of that really depends on the parents' motivation and willingness to allow that to happen. But I think now the space that we live in, there's so much access to getting help and care. And when your parents are not someone who are ready to hold on to these feelings for you, you might have to find somewhere else and find someone else to hold it for you, whether that is a friend, an external support, or a mental health professional, until you can hold it all onto it yourself, you know. But I think even in this case, it just has to be an appeal to the parents to be okay with their own sense of failure, their own sense of perfection that they deal with. It must be an exhaustive place for the parent also to be when they are not ready to accept failures from their children. So I think that's a sign that the parent has a lot of emotional work to go through. But I would just ask the child to reach out for whatever kind of mental health support that they can seek, and listen to voices besides their own parents, I think.
Thank you, Ms. Kullar. So, first of all, thank you for answering all the questions. Here's the last question for you. That sometimes children are not able to share with their parents about the mental health issues they're going through, but still, if the parents feel that the child is not in a positive mental state, so what strategies can be used by the parents to support the child experiencing a mental health issue?
Can you repeat the first part of the question, that when the child is not able to express what they're going through?
Yeah, actually, I was just saying that, sometimes children are not really comfortable opening up to their parents, but still, if the parent has a feeling that the child is not in a positive state of mental health issue, so I'm in a state of mental health. So, what strategies can be used by the parents to support the child at that time?
I think in this situation, it would have to be the strategy of waiting and being patient in waiting for the child to trust you and consider you a reliable support. Maybe the child just wants some distance and needs some distance from you. If that is what they need, you will have to bear that role of being someone that your child doesn't want to be around in this moment. But as I said, needing distance can also be asking for space to work through something difficult. So you will have to allow them the right to work through what they are dealing with, and and remind them that you are there when they are ready to talk about it. So waiting for them to take your help, waiting for them to need your help, and if not, I think just the fact that they know someone's presence is there is enough. For sometimes that's all that they need in a moment like that.
Thank you, Ms. Killer, for answering all the questions. Again, thank you for the whole informative session. It was really interesting to hear you out today. Thank you.
Thanks, and I'm sorry about the mini hiccups that happened through it. I was really trying to stay within time, but it was really exciting talking about these things.